Good morning. This is Kanika Young at the Tennessee Justice Center. Thank you for joining today's webinar. If you can hear me, could you please type into the chat box? Also, if you can see the screen, just note that you can see it. Okay, great. I'm getting some feedback that you guys can hear me and you can see the screen. So it is 11, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us. This is a timely topic that we hope you will get some good information from that will be able to inform your work and also just to stay informed about what is going to impact children in Tennessee related to the Affordable Care Act. We'll go ahead and jump in. Again, I'm Kanika Young. I'm the Director of Children's Health at the Tennessee Justice Center. I invite you to submit your questions during the webinar, and I will do my best to try to read them and respond to them as I go along just to make sure that things are clear. And if you want to wait until the end and type your questions, hopefully there'll be time at the end to do that. Also, we are recording today's webinar, so I'll send out a copy of that recording along with a copy of the slides. So the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is what we're talking about today. It's also known as Obamacare. It was passed during President Obama's administration by Congress in 2010, and then it was implemented in 2014. There are many popular provisions of the Act that a lot of people are aware of. Those include Medicaid expansion, which allows states to expand eligibility for their Medicaid programs up to 138% of the federal poverty level, so that people who were previously not eligible for Medicaid can enroll in the program. It provides marketplace subsidies for people to purchase plans directly on the healthcare.gov exchange. It also has protections for people with pre-existing conditions to make healthcare more affordable and accessible for them. And another popular provision is the requirement that young adults can stay on their parents' health plans until they turn 26. Regardless of the shortcomings of the Affordable Care Act, it was really the first major health care litigation that was passed in this country in about 50 years. It had a significant impact in bringing down the rates of uninsured people across the country. As a result of the Affordable Care Act, tens of millions of Americans purchased plans on the exchange, and another 20 million people got access to coverage in states that expanded Medicaid. The Act also includes protections for 10 essential health benefits. Those include things like treatment for substance use disorders and mental health, and also maternal care, which was not a standard benefit that was provided in plans before the ACA. It also has protections for access to reproductive health services, as well as some important anti-discrimination protections for members of the LGBTQ+ community. So right now, there is a case pending in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals called Texas v. United States. We're not going to get into the legal analysis of that case today, but I just want to give you a little background about the lawsuit, just to provide some context for our discussion. So there are about 18 states represented by Republican attorneys general, as well as 2 Republican governors that have brought the case against the United States, arguing that the ACA is unconstitutional and should be struck down. The case was filed in 2018 after Congress ended the individual mandate that required people to purchase plans on the exchange if they did not have employer-sponsored insurance or have coverage through some other way, such as Medicaid or Medicare. Texas was the leading state, and it was joined initially by 19 other states in suing the federal government in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Texas. The opposition to that challenge is being led by California's Attorney General, as well as 17 other Democratic Attorneys General who intervened to defend the ACA. The intervention was necessary because the U.S. Department of Justice under the Trump administration declined to defend the ACA and actually argued that it should be struck down. In December of 2018, the federal district judge in the Northern District of Texas issued a ruling declaring that the entire ACA is unconstitutional. That ruling drew criticism from both sides, liberal and conservative. While I am a lawyer, I am not a constitutional law expert, but even constitutional law experts were scratching their heads in response to this decision, and they struggled to really explain the legal basis for it. But nevertheless, the federal district judge entered his ruling, and he also issued a stay on his ruling while the case worked its way through the appeals process. Additional states joined, a few states left as a result of passing Medicaid expansion in their states and different political things that were happening. And so the case proceeded to oral argument. The Department of Justice, prior to the oral argument, filed a brief saying that the court should strike down the entire ACA and not just protections for pre-existing conditions, which is what they were previously arguing. So there was a little bit of a change in course there. The Texas and other plaintiff states filed their brief, also arguing that the entire ACA should be invalidated. That was in April of this year. A reply brief was filed by the defendants who were intervening from those Democratic attorneys general, and then oral arguments happened in July. So we've been expecting a decision from the Fifth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals sometime this fall. It should come down any day now. And so we thought it would be a good time to have this webinar and provide some information about what exactly it would mean or what it could mean if this important act was declared unconstitutional and was done away with. So there are three main things that the court is considering in the litigation. One is whether the parties even have standing to seek the court's intervention on this matter. Another is whether the ACA's individual mandate is constitutional, and if the individual mandate is unconstitutional, whether it can be severed or considered separately from the rest of the Affordable Care Act. And so other provisions such as Medicaid expansion or protections for pre-existing conditions, et cetera, whether those provisions would have to be invalidated or whether they could go forward without the individual mandate. So in addition to stripping away these popular provisions that I just mentioned, there are some lesser known provisions that specifically have benefited people on Medicaid and CHIP. So today we're going to be focused on children, but it's important to note that these programs, particularly Medicaid, covers adults as well. It covers adults with disabilities. It covers low-income adults who are elderly. It covers parents and caretakers of children, and it covers pregnant women. So there are a wide group of enrollees who benefited from these programs, but again, we're going to try to focus for the most part on children today. So starting out, we want to note that Medicaid and CHIP has importance in covering children and ensuring that they have a healthy start in life. There are studies showing that children who are enrolled in Medicaid and have access to that comprehensive coverage do better in school. They miss fewer days of school due to illness or injury. They're also more likely to finish high school, to attend college, and even graduate from college. They have fewer emergency room visits and hospitalizations as adults, and they end up earning more as adults as a result of being healthy and able to work and provide for themselves and their families. In Tennessee, our Medicaid program is called TennCare, and it covers half of all babies born in the state. So it's a really significant source of funding for the state's NICUs. It covers half of all children in the state, and in fact, half of all TennCare enrollees are children. I know there's a lot of half, and half, but it's important to note that there's significant coverage for this program, and for that reason, our healthcare system really depends on these programs to remain viable and to have a strong infrastructure to cover people even who aren't enrolled directly in the program. Tennessee's CHIP is known as Cover Kids, and it stands on the shoulders of Medicaid to provide coverage for kids and pregnant women whose income is too high to qualify for TennCare. So the Affordable Care Act had what's known as a welcome mat effect. Prior to implementation of the Affordable Care Act, TennCare served about 1.2 million Tennesseans, and after the Affordable Care Act was implemented, enrollment really increased, really as a result of a couple of things. One is the new focus on health care in this country. The Affordable Care Act was pretty controversial at the time when it was passed and implemented, so it was in the news a lot. So just by virtue of hearing about health insurance, people were looking into it and going on to the websites and finding out whether they qualified for marketplace subsidies or whether they qualified for Medicaid or CHIP. And so as a result, a lot more people got enrolled, not just those who bought ACA plans, but also people who qualified for Medicaid or CHIP who maybe didn't know it prior to the publicity that the ACA got. So after implementation, TennCare saw an increase in enrollment to almost 1.6 million people. So that's over 500,000 people, or a little under 500,000 people who joined the program. So that's actually a significant boost to that enrollment. And also at this same time, TennCare paused its redetermination process. We'll get into the reasons why in a little bit, but essentially people were enrolling in the program and very few people were leaving the program. So today, TennCare still covers approximately 1.4 million people, so a few less, about 200,000 less than it was at that peak, but that's still a significant increase from pre-ACA days. And we've lost some ground since we reached these historic rates of coverage, but we're still higher than the pre-ACA days. And so that welcome mat effect essentially is people are joining and participating in the health insurance marketplace as a result of the publicity from the ACA. So what are these lesser known provisions that the ACA provided that apply to Medicaid and CHIP? First is the maintenance of eligibility standards for children. The ACA prohibited states from making it more difficult for eligible children and families to enroll in Medicaid and CHIP. So approximately 68,000 more children are covered today under TennCare and Cover Kids since the ACA was implemented. Again, that was because the federal government put in place some eligibility standards that were supposed to make it easier for parents to enroll and also to qualify for the program. So the Medicaid coverage for children under the ACA was boosted. The ACA required that states align their minimum threshold for Medicaid eligibility, so children under the age of 18 could qualify up to 138% of the federal poverty level. For the previous cutoff at 100% of federal poverty level, that equates to about $20,000 a year for a family of three. These numbers, I think, are slightly higher now because the federal poverty level is adjusted annually, but it's still in that range. And so it went from about $20,000 a year for a family of three up to $28,000. So more kids qualified for the program. It also simplified the navigation of the healthcare system for parents and caregivers so that if you had a family who had children of different ages, parents didn't have to figure out getting one child enrolled in TennCare and getting another child enrolled in CHIP. Because it had a higher income cutoff, they would be able to enroll both their kids in the same program. children would be entitled to those same comprehensive benefits under Medicaid that they wouldn't necessarily get under CHIP. And so it just made it more simpler for parents to understand what benefits their children could get and to only have to figure out how to navigate one program. So Medicaid provides certain benefits that CHIP does not, and so including immunizations, physical exams, dental and vision insurance, which are add-ons for the CHIP program. So this elimination of what's called the stair-step framework benefits Tennessee families because parents don't have to navigate two sets of eligibility requirements, coverage, or cost-sharing rules for children in the same family. If the ACA were repealed, it could roll back the federal poverty level minimum threshold to 100% for children ages 6 to 19, and that would cause nearly 5 million children nationally to lose Medicaid coverage. That's close to 10% of the U.S. school-age population. So it would be a significant loss of coverage just based on eligibility. The next provision that is not as widely publicized that the ACA provided, which is something that is in alignment with a provision that is more popular, and that's for former foster youth to stay Medicaid eligible until they turn 26. Foster children are likely to have more complex medical needs than those who are not in foster care, so it's really important that they have access to this coverage. And the ACA allows young adults to stay on their parents' health insurance up to age 26, and so this provision is meant to grant a similar protection to former foster care children who age out. When they turn 18, they're automatically eligible for Medicaid until they turn 26, and that's regardless of their income. In Tennessee, approximately 1,550 children will age out of foster care this year, and so that's the number of children in Tennessee who would be presumptively eligible for TennCare Medicaid coverage. And it's important to note that they have Medicaid throughout their time in foster care, so this will be a continuation of that eligibility after they age out. Another provision of the ACA that has benefited children in Tennessee on Medicaid and CHIP is Simplified Eligibility. This is a new uniform income counting system. The ACA introduced the Modified Adjusted Gross Income, or MAGI, for Medicaid beneficiaries, and this applies to those on Medicaid other than seniors and some people with disabilities. So children are what's considered a MAGI category. The ACA also prohibited asset tests for MAGI individuals, including children. So you're looking at their income and not necessarily assets such as homes or cars or other resources to determine eligibility. So that made it easier for people to determine eligibility and to get enrolled in the program. The ACA also provided for simplified enrollment systems and procedures, and it required that state Medicaid agencies create a streamlined application, enrollment, and eligibility redetermination processes. Part of that was to require ex parte renewals, and what that means is the state is required to refer to other sources of information to determine if an applicant remains eligible for the program. For example, if a family is enrolled in SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as food stamps, some of the same information that's required for that SNAP eligibility is going to be important to make a decision on the Medicaid application. So states are administering both of those programs, so they already have access to that information. And the ACA basically said, state, you don't have to ask this family multiple times for the same information when they're enrolled in both of these programs. You can use what they've given you for SNAP to determine if they remain eligible for Medicaid. So because of these new streamlined systems and procedures, many states had computer systems that were not up to snuff. And so Tennessee launched this effort to create a new computer system. It's called TEDS, which stands for TennCare Eligibility Determination System. That process took 7 years from start to finish and over $400 million to get to working. It was launched in March of this year, and prior to that, the TennCare Bureau began doing manual redeterminations at some point. While the states were working on their computer systems, they had permission from the federal government to pause redeterminations, and that's just a process where a state reviews the current enrollees and makes sure that they still qualify for the program based on their category and their income information. And so that process was paused, and in late 2016, the state decided we're going to start back doing redeterminations. Even though we still don't have a computer system, it had been delayed, they just decided to go ahead and let's do this manually. So while TEDS was not operational, the state contracted with a private vendor to make eligibility redeterminations. This vendor made the redeterminations manually, which led to many determinations being made on incomplete or inaccurate information due to no fault of the enrollee. We've heard from many families who found out that they had been disenrolled only when they went to a doctor's office or when they went to pick up a prescription at the pharmacy and they were told you no longer have TennCare. And come to find out, they were supposed to fill out a packet that had supposedly been mailed to their household. Many people never got these packets, even if they didn't move and they'd been at the same address for many years, or even in cases where they did move, but they notified the state of their new address, they never received the packets at their correct addresses. So this was a huge problem while these manual redeterminations were happening, and as a result, 83,000 fewer children were, or actually 83,000 children were uninsured in 2018, which is an increase of 43% since 2016. Tennessee actually saw the nation's largest increase in the rate of uninsured children as a result of this red tape fiasco, and so our rate increased to 5.2% of uninsured children in 2018 compared to 3.7% in 2016. Again, TEDS was fully implemented in March of 2019, and since then, child TennCare enrollment has increased by over 17,000, but enrollment is still down by over 58,000 children since November 2016, which is when redeterminations really got up and running. So there is a need to ensure confidence in the eligibility determination process and to make sure that TEDS is actually working as it should have been designed to work, to make sure that people who are eligible are getting the right determination when they are going through this process. So since TEDS was only launched a few months ago, time will tell if TennCare is able to work out the kinks and to make sure people are getting the right determinations. But bringing TEDS online was a huge investment that was done to comply with the Affordable Care Act. The system was designed in accordance with the provisions of the Affordable Care Act. And so given how long it took to get the system online, we don't know what happens if it has to be redesigned if the Affordable Care Act goes away. If they, launch into a process of changing the configuration of the system to be pre-ACA compliant, then how long will that take and how will that impact enrollees? That's a question that we have and that is really unanswered right now. Another provision from the Affordable Care Act is healthcare delivery system reforms. The ACA provided a Medicaid option for states to set up health homes to coordinate care for those with chronic conditions. This was an optional Medicaid state plan benefit to allow states to do this, and Tennessee did take advantage of it. In 2017, they submitted an amendment to their state plan to create health home models for adults with serious mental illnesses and for children with severe emotional disturbances. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, these health homes are not a physical structure, but it's rather an approach to providing comprehensive primary care. The idea is that the primary care team develops a trusting relationship with the family and works as a partner to assure that all of the child's needs are met. It's really a dynamic process that's driven by the health status and developmental progress of the child, and it's specific to the needs of the child and the family. The primary care physician really has that expertise with the child to coordinate care among different providers and to help the family navigate receiving care from multiple providers. So it's coordinated by the primary care physician, and it makes sure that care is accessible, compassionate, it's comprehensive, continuous, coordinated, culturally effective, and family-centered. So Tennessee's plan aims to meet those needs by improving the quality of care that beneficiaries receive during the management of their chronic conditions and illnesses. It aims to improve efficiency and decrease the cost of care that beneficiaries receive by improving coordination of care between beneficiaries, their behavior and physical health providers, and their social supports. And it also is intended to improve the overall beneficiary experience of receiving care. Another delivery system reform was the creation of the Center for Medicare, Medicaid Innovation. The acronym is CMMI. This was created to test delivery system and payment reforms that can lower costs while increasing access to care and improving quality of care. Under this reform, there were grants created. One is called Integrated Care for Kids, known as INC, and the other is Maternal Opioid Misuse. That acronym is MOM. These programs were launched as a result of the Affordable Care Act, and the INC program specifically announced that it was making available up to $16 million to 8 different states who were chosen based on their submissions for a model to implement this program. It provides funding specifically to states so that they can partner with local organizations to test whether payment supporting integrated service delivery across behavioral health, physical health, and other child services would actually reduce Medicaid and CHIP expenditures while improving the quality of care. The INC model is supposed to assist states and local communities to address those priority health concerns for children, such as behavioral challenges, and it specifically referenced the opioid and other substance use challenges that many states are struggling with, including Tennessee. So it's intended to address the impacts of opioid use and abuse on families in the state. MOM is also a grant program. It allows a maximum of $64.5 million with an M to be available to up to 12 states for implementing this model, so that would be divided among those 12 states. We expect that states that have been awarded funding under these programs will be announced later this year, and that the models would be implemented starting in 2020. The funding for these programs was expanded through follow-up legislation by Congress, but the actual provisions that created them were a result of were in the Affordable Care Act. Another program that falls in that category would be the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, or MCV for short. While this isn't a Medicaid or CHIP provision per se, it does complement these programs because some of the same families who are enrolled in Medicaid and CHIP would also be eligible for home visiting under MCV, and this particular funding supports the Tennessee Home Visiting Program, which provides voluntary evidence-based home visiting programs for at-risk pregnant women and families with children through kindergarten age. It builds upon decades of scientific research showing that home visits by a nurse social worker, early childhood educator, or other trained professional during pregnancy and in the first couple of years of a child's life really helps prevent child abuse and neglect. It supports positive parenting. It improves maternal and child health, and it promotes child development and school readiness. In fiscal year 2018, Tennessee had 3,145 participants in their McV-funded home visiting programs. That represents over 1,500 households, and it provided over 19,000 home visits in 23 rural counties in Tennessee, as well as 15 non-rural counties across the state. So the federal funding for McV, again, it has been extended by Congress, but the underlying McV provision was in the Affordable Care Act. So again, we don't know what happens to that program in future years if the ACA goes away. Let me check and see if we've gotten questions. I'm kind of multitasking here. Don't see any questions. Again, if you have questions during the webinar, feel free to type them in, and I'll try to check back as we go to make sure that we are tracking along nicely. So the next provision that the ACA provided was increased Medicaid rebates to lower prescription drug costs. Under the Medicaid drug rebate program, drug manufacturers must enter into a Medicaid National Drug Rebate Agreement with the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services in order for the states to receive federal funding for using the manufacturer's products. This program keeps prescription drug costs down for consumers by ensuring that they're subsidized under the state Medicaid program. For an improved name brand manufacturer, the minimum rebate was increased to 23.1% after the passage of the Affordable Care Act. So that was from 15.1 to 23.1 under the ACA. The ACA also allowed managed care organizations the option to negotiate their own rebates with manufacturers, and most states, including Tennessee, have negotiated those supplemental rebates with drug manufacturers. So what happens to those those pricing agreements and rebate programs if the ACA goes away? Arguably, the minimum base rebate would go back to 15.1%, and that would cost states and enrollees additional money to continue meeting their prescription drug needs. Another provision is increased public input for Medicaid and CHIP waivers. Under the Affordable Care Act, a state is required to hear public comments prior to the submission of a Section 1115 waiver. Section 1115 is part of the Social Security Act that allows states to submit innovative ideas or programs to make the Medicaid program work better and achieve its objectives. Since 1115 waivers have been available to the states, or actually Section 1115 waivers have been available to states since the 1960s, but prior to the Affordable Care Act, there wasn't a public discourse when states were submitting these waivers. They would basically just happen, under the cover of night, and then the next day the state would announce that they've gotten this approval or what have you, and the public didn't have an opportunity to really consider that waiver and to weigh in on what it would mean for them personally or for the communities that they serve who are enrolled in Medicaid. So now, since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, the state has to hold public hearings, and they have to provide a 30-day comment period to submit comments about the waiver to the state. There's also a 30-day federal comment period where people can submit comments to CMS, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It's really important way to work out issues within the proposal and to sometimes prevent harmful waivers from being granted. In the case of work reporting requirements, the comments that were submitted during the comment period for that waiver really made the difference in giving the state or giving the court the evidence and support that it needed to find that the waiver would not meet the objectives of the program. The rules require that CMS, when they're reviewing the proposal, they must consider whether it would increase and strengthen overall coverage of low-income individuals, increase access to stabilize and strengthen providers and provider networks that are available to serve the Medicaid populations, improve health outcomes for Medicaid and other low-income populations, or increase the efficiency and quality of care for Medicaid and other low-income populations through initiatives to transform service delivery networks. And so in considering whether the proposal does all those things, the court had those comments to look to, and they said to the state of Kentucky, your proposal doesn't reflect that you considered these comments that would show that the work reporting requirements would not have the desired effect of increasing or strengthening access to coverage or improving health outcomes for the Medicaid enrollees, and therefore the approval, CMS's approval of that waiver was struck down. So in Tennessee, we also have been facing a work reporting requirements waiver proposal that TennCare submitted last year, and the Tennessee Justice Center led efforts to gather comments on that proposal, and we submitted a record-breaking number of comments, over 13,000, and that's thanks to, again, the process that was put in place by the Affordable Care Act. It remains to be seen what happens with Tennessee's work reporting requirements proposal, given that the other states that have tried this have been stopped in their efforts. We still await a decision from CMS about the proposal that Tennessee submitted. Another waiver proposal that's in the pipeline is the block grant proposal. That's Tennessee's latest Section 1115 waiver application. Again, the Tennessee Justice Center has been leading efforts to submit comments on that proposal. The state comment period started in September 18th and went through October 18th. And again, we were really successful in drawing out from Medicaid beneficiaries and communities that serve them what this proposal would mean for people who are enrolled in Medicaid and how it would not promote increased access to care or improve health outcomes or any of the objectives that an 1115 waiver is supposed to accomplish. So the jury's still out on what happens with that proposal, but it will be up for a federal comment period after the state considers the comments that it received during the state comment period. If the Affordable Care Act is repealed, we don't know whether this public process would still be available to Medicaid beneficiaries when their states are submitting these 1115 waivers. The last provision, or actually that was the last provision, but the last point that I want to make is that even for people who aren't children who are enrolled in this program, losing coverage for parents is going to have an impact on kids. Studies have shown that when parents are uninsured, it's more likely that their kids won't be enrolled in insurance programs, even if the kids are eligible. Just to illustrate this point, between 2013 and 2014, which is the first year of full implementation of the Affordable Care Act, children's Medicaid and CHIP participation rates went up from 88.7% to 91% as a result of more adults gaining coverage through Medicaid or the marketplace. And in states that expanded Medicaid to adults, they saw higher children's Medicaid and CHIP participation rates in 2014 compared to states that did not expand. And so the states that have the largest participation gains for children are the ones that expanded Medicaid. That's as a result of adults having that coverage. They're more likely to take advantage of what's available to their children as a result. And so the ACA repeal could increase the uninsured rate among adults by an estimated 20 million people, because those are the people who were enrolled in Medicaid as a result of expansion. just by taking that coverage away from the adults, there's concern that it would have a ripple effect on children and that they would not be enrolled in Medicaid at the great numbers that we're seeing today. So there are fewer uninsured parents as a result of the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, and that has also helped to boost the child enrollment rates as well. Rolling back that coverage would have harmful impacts on kids' coverage. So just want to end by talking about the Tennessee Justice Center work in this area. We really do three main things related to the accessible health insurance programs for kids and adults in the state. We work with individuals who need help navigating the system. That's how we're able to get insight into how the system is functioning or dysfunctioning for families. And then we take what we learn from that individual casework to identify systemic issues and advocate to change those either through lobbying or through litigation or other systemic work in the state. We also do training and technical assistance. This is an example of the trainings that we provide on various topics. So we really rely on providers and other community partners, as well as our clients, to help us gain that knowledge and expertise to make the system function better for everyone in the state. If you have any questions about anything that I've just talked about, please feel free to type them into the question box, and I will do my best to answer them. While people think of questions, I will go ahead and talk about how you can do more to help us in our advocacy efforts. So you can join us. The easiest thing to do is to sign up for emails. We have email alerts that are really focused on different areas of interest. One is our advocacy email listserv that covers general Medicaid expansion and defense topics. So things like the block grant proposal, the work reporting requirements, efforts to get Tennessee to finally expand Medicaid. Those are the types of topics that the advocacy emails would cover. The Children's Health listserv is the one that I send out, and that covers essentially all health issues that impact children. There's lots of overlap for kids because of the connection between adults having coverage and kids being enrolled in programs. So that's another listserv that is going to talk about Medicaid expansion, and it's going to talk about threats to Medicaid, such as block grant or work reporting requirements. We also have a nutrition team here at the Tennessee Justice Center. They send out email alerts about threats to the SNAP program and opportunities to expand access to meals, including school meal programs across the state. So that would be a good listserv to sign up for if you're interested in nutrition access. We also have a training listserv for providers who want to get into the nuts and bolts of the Medicaid system, as well as other programs that the state administers for people who have significant health care needs. And then we have the Independence listserv. That is for adults with disabilities or with special health care needs, such as people who are elderly, and that would really cover things like what's happening with the Choices program or with ECF Choices, which are programs for individuals with disabilities and who have long-term needs for supports and services. Another way you can join us is to follow TJC on Facebook and on Twitter. We send out periodic updates and news about things happening in the healthcare space that impacts people in Tennessee, as well as explaining things that are happening nationally and how it impacts people on the local and state level. So I'll check one more time, see if we have any questions. And if you think of questions after the webinar, feel free to email me. My email will be on the slide deck. And it's also going to be email out to you the webinar recording and a copy of these slides. So if you think of questions later, feel free to shoot me an email, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you have. So that is really the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We close out with this quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane." We hope that you learned something new today that you can use in your work or in your volunteer efforts, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.